crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only three people you can trust in life: your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Could you be quiet? What is this? It's my new teeth. It's your new teeth.
I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. Today marks the beginning of the jet-set COP28, where world leaders, among 70,000 in total, including British ones, fly into, in this case, Dubai via private jet to tell you why you aren't doing enough to save the environment. But as ever, this is just another example of how we have lent sovereignty to unelected and unaccountable institutions. Oh, and more trouble for the Home Office as it emerges that a scandalous 17,000 migrants have vamoosed, while a senior civil servant confesses there is no plan B. If the Rwanda plan fails, in spite of the Home Secretary's remark that the policy wasn't the be-all and the end-all of the government's migration policy. A foreign policy titan of the 20th and 21st century dies not long after marking a century on this earth. Dr. Henry Kissinger is dead at the age of 100, and the debate over his legacy begins. Some say an intellectual hero who helped navigate the West through the Cold War, but others say he was a war criminal. Plus, it's been more than 50 years since the sad day when 240 pennies to the pound became 100. But now we're free from the tyrannical metric system of the EU. Is it time to start selling pints of wine and champagne? State of the Nation starts now. Joined by a highly intellectual panel this evening, the editor of Conservative Home, Paul Goodman, and GB News' very own senior political commentator, Nigel Nelson. As always, you know this, I want to hear from you. It's a crucial part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. But now it's time for the news of the day with Aaron Armstrong.
Very good evening to you. I'm Aaron Armstrong. Two hostages have been released from Gaza following a last-minute deal between Israel and Hamas to extend their temporary ceasefire. 21-year-old Mia Skem was reunited with her family earlier, and a 40-year-old Israeli woman has also arrived safely at hospital in Israel. Meanwhile, talks to extend the truce for another 2 days are continuing in Qatar. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has again vowed to eradicate Hamas after the terror group claimed responsibility for a shooting that killed 3 people in Jerusalem. At least 8 others were injured in the attack during rush hour outside the entrance to the capital city. Police say the 2 suspected attackers were neutralised on the spot by off-duty officers. Here in the UK, Matt Hancock says a culture of fear inside Downing Street, created by Boris Johnson's chief advisor, undermined the government's pandemic response. The former Health Secretary described Dominic Cummings as a malign actor at the COVID inquiry and said the country should have gone into lockdown sooner.
If we'd had the doctrine that I propose, which is as soon as you know you've got a lockdown, you lock down as soon as possible, then we would have got the lockdown done over that weekend, in on the 2nd of March, 3 weeks earlier than before. There's a doubling rate at this point estimated every 3 to 4 days. We would have been 6 doublings ahead of where we were, which means that fewer than a tenth of the number of people would have died in the first wave.
Tributes have been paid from both sides of the political divide to the former Labour Chancellor Alistair Darling, who's died at the age of 70. Lord Darling served as a cabinet minister for 13 years under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, who praised his wisdom, calmness in a crisis and his humour. The Prime Minister said he was a dedicated public servant who served the country through challenging times. And the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, described his loss as immeasurable.
Alistair's death has caused a shock and a profound sadness across not just the whole Labour movement, but across everybody who loved him and respected him. And that's basically everybody who knew him. He was the dedicated public servant. He was kind. I was privileged to know him as a friend and to have his advice. And our hearts go out to Maggie, his wife, and their children on this very, very sad day.
Shane McGowan, the frontman of the Pogues, has died at the age of 65. He was discharged from hospital last week after being diagnosed with encephalitis. The singer, who was born on Christmas Day, is best known for the 1987 hit Fairy Tale of New York, one of the most cherished festive songs. He died peacefully with his wife by his side. Rail passengers are being warned to expect disruption over the coming week because of strikes, and that's despite the RMT members voting to accept a deal to end their long-running dispute over pay and conditions. However, train drivers represented by the ASLEF union at 16 rail operators are set to hold an overtime ban from tomorrow. Donald Trump has again been barred from commenting publicly about court staff as part of his ongoing fraud trial in New York. A gagging order was first imposed on the former president in October after he accused a clerk of being politically biased. The judge overseeing the case said the court had been inundated with hundreds of threats. Mr. Trump is also under a similar order regarding his effort to overturn the 2020 presidential election. And the Prime Minister has switched on the lights of the Downing Street Christmas tree.
3, 2, 1.
Well, Rishi Sunak joked it was nice to click a button and make everything brighter. Christmas carols were played and there were over 100 guests in attendance at a festive market in Downing Street earlier. This is GB News. We're live across the UK on TV, digital radio and on your smart speaker too. Now, it's back to Jacob.
It's hard to believe more than 2 years have passed since the dramatic moment COP26, hosted in Glasgow, came to a tearful end. The 26th conference of the parties was defined by an anticlimactic moment when the Chinese and Indians modified a non-legally binding agreement. The words in the agreement were changed from the, quote, phasing out of coal to, quote, phasing down. Anyone would have thought from the tone of the room that World War III had just been declared as the hall went silent, and then the president of the conference, Alok Sharma, appeared to shed a manly tear. But it was pure theatre. Since then, China has built countless coal power stations, just this year announcing plans for another 100 of them, and it currently emits nearly a third of world emissions. So much for phasing down, let alone phasing out. And so the theatre continues, this time in Dubai, as today marks the beginning of COP28, and the hypocrisy is alive and kicking. As ever, world leaders will be pontificating in the usual style, and it will be very understandable if poor old Joe Biden falls asleep, as he did previously, and who can blame him? For this year, already protesters are calling for veganism to become enshrined in law. Well, if that ever happened, I think I might break the law. But perhaps, more importantly, the United Kingdom has defended its sending of 3 private jets to the climate conference. His Majesty, King Charles, the Prime Minister and Lord Cameron will fly separately to the summit in Dubai. At COP26 in Glasgow, there were more than 100 private jets which flew in for the conference. And this conference is set to have the largest carbon footprint of them all so far. And your leaders are set to give £60 million of your money to climate causes. However, The conference of the parties is merely a symptom of a much wider problem within our society. Over the past 20 years, we've transferred sovereignty away from our democratic institutions that you vote for to unelected and unaccountable ones. Obvious examples can be found with the Bank of England or the rather arrogant Scientific Advisory Committee for Emergencies, SAGE. But climate change is perhaps the worst subject of all for this phenomenon. We have the Paris Climate Accords, the Climate Change Committee, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and of course, COP. But these sorts of institutions, which are free from scrutiny and democratic accountability, always show the same problems. Bureaucratic groupthink, as they don't have to justify their decisions to a potentially cold and poor electorate. Perhaps even more importantly, the implicit premise behind them is that experts should make the important decisions and not democratically elected politicians. It's high time we reduce the powers of these institutions and reinforce the democratic ones. As always, I want to hear from you, mailmog@gbnews.com. Now, once again, I'm pleased to be joined by a friend of the programme, the director of the Climate Media Coalition, Donncha McCarthy. Donncha, thank you for coming in again.
Good evening, Jacob.
You and I have very different views on how climate change should be tackled, but do we at least agree that COP has become a ridiculous bean feast?
Well, COP has been meeting for 30 years to seek to tackle climate change, and every year it's met, the emissions have gone up. So clearly it's a failure. And the reason why it's a failure is because it's a UN body that has to include everybody. And so that means that we've got around 20 petro-dictatorships able to weaken the commitments and block any meaningful action being taken that will actually, in real terms, bring down carbon dioxide emissions.
And you've got 70,000 people going. What can they all be doing? How can they be involved?
Well, it's actually, it's just insane. The first COP had 2,000 people. This is 70. And they are not climate activists, Jacob, there. There are thousands of meat lobbyists, there are thousands of oil executives, there are thousands of airline executives trying to stop action behind the scenes. And what I would think would be brilliant is there's people who actually did with tobacco. A friend of mine was involved in the tobacco negotiations. How do we get an international agreement on banning advertising tobacco? And you know what the secret was? Get the lobbyists out of the room. Get the oil lobbyists out of COP and we might have an action.
Well, you see, I'm in strong agreement with you that it should be elected politicians who are meeting and discussing these things and then reporting back to their electorates. And if they have a mandate, they'll go your way or they'll go my way. But it will have a democratic mandate. What seems to happen here is you get an agreement written at the end that is heavily influenced by lobbyists, by big donors and all of those sorts of things that isn't achieving what either of us want.
Yeah, well, I mean, you talked about sovereignty, but actually COP has zero sovereignty. The 2015-2016 Paris Agreement, no legal mechanisms to implement it. And so what we've been seeing is governments go there, they make an agreement, you know, Obama, Cameron, whatever, went to make the agreement. They came back and they didn't implement it because there's no legal mechanism.
Yeah, except we are taking steps. So yesterday, the House of Commons had a committee that put through the effective ban on petrol cars by 2030, which I know you would be in favour of, and I'm not. But this is coming from COP. It's coming from these agreements that emerge.
No, what's coming through Parliament is the pressure from the public to actually act. Look, Nigel, sorry. Sorry.
I'm not going to the jungle.
We're your stars. So what we're actually looking at this year is extraordinary science. I don't know if you've seen any of the graphs. What we climate activists have complained for years is scientists aren't using dramatic language. It's been very scientific, very geeky language. And we've been saying, please express it in the alarming terms that need. Scientists this year are saying they're terrified. They're looking at the hottest day ever in 125,000 years. We're looking at floods, food inflation, fires across the planet, and poor people in Britain are now paying the price because the ECIU said the inflation this year came from two sources, Jacob. First of all, food inflation due to extreme weather around the world, and secondly, inflation due to fossil fuel inflation. So we need to move ourselves off those for two reasons: to protect the future for the climate and to protect our food security.
But if you take the fossil fuel inflation, that's come because we haven't been maximising our own output. estimate that if we had been fracking and doing things like that and hadn't made ourselves so dependent on the Russian dictatorship, the price of gas would not have gone up so much. And one of the main reasons for food inflation was the cutting off of supplies from Ukraine, which had a very strong effect on the cost of grains.
So two-thirds of the food inflation this year, you're correct, came from the fossil fuel inflation and from the Ukraine situation. However, in my local shop, there's a sign up saying no olive oil until the new year. So Southern Europe has been experiencing what the climate scientists predicted 30 years ago, is that Southern Europe is beginning to desertify. And that is now impacting on massive fires, and the olive oil crop is in emergency.
But forest fires are something that's happened in nature since before mankind existed.
That's
and
true.
You've also had seasonal disruptions to crops. That again is something that we've been used to, and in some years in previous centuries you had famines in this country, let alone abroad. So this is part of how nature actually operates. You can't assume that there will always be a good harvest. It just doesn't work like that.
No, absolutely not. And Chatham House said, looking at current science, extreme weather events happen simultaneously in our food baskets, around 1 in every 1,000 years. And Chatham House, which I think, hopefully you agree, is a fairly respectable think tank, they now estimate by 2040s extreme weather events will be happening simultaneously in our food baskets. And then think through the consequence of that for poor people within food inflation, one of the worst inflation.
I'm going to ask you one final question, a very short answer. Do you think the COP helps or hinders your campaigning?
It's a failure.
It's a failure. OK, there we go. Thank you to Donica. Coming up, can you guess how many migrants have gone missing in the UK? And those of you paying attention earlier will already know the answer. And don't forget, we'll be asking the all-important question, is it time for pints of champagne in Britain's shops and pubs and clubs?
We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays on GB News.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
to find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News,
the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquia, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Could you be quiet? What is this? It's my new teeth.
It's your new teeth. I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is still State of the Nation. We've been discussing COP28, and you've been sending in your views. Graham says they won't give the voter a choice on net zero, for they might not choose net zero. I think that's probably true. And Peter says David Cameron, Rishi Sunak and the King should all have used the same plane. In my opinion, none of them should have taken a flight there. They could have done it on Zoom if they're that concerned about CO2. Well, Peter, I think you hit the nail on the head, and they're probably not as concerned as all that after all. Shortly after his appointment, the new Home Secretary rather oddly decided to quote Macbeth on the prospect of assassinating Duncan when he said that the Rwanda plan was not the, quote, be-all and end-all of the government's plans to solve the migrant crisis. And yet, at an evidence session at the Commons Home Affairs Committee yesterday, a remarkably clueless, albeit senior civil servant, Sir Matthew Rycroft, confessed there was no plan B. But perhaps more importantly, the same session also revealed that 17,000 migrants have vamoosed. Asylum claims are withdrawn if asylum seekers fail to respond to 2 successive caseworker interview requests. And this happened more than 17,000 times since December last year. So where are these people? Well, the Home Office is in blissful ignorance. So surely we need to assert some control. And what plan is there other than the deterrence of Rwanda? Well, with me now is my panel, the great intellects of the Conservative Homes, Paul Goodman, and GB News' senior political commentator, Nigel Nelson. Nigel, if not Rwanda, what? And why doesn't the Home Office have any idea about where these people are?
Well, in answer to the second question, I find these figures all a bit suspicious, much as the Tory MP Tim Lawton did when he was on the committee, which is what he said. They're trying to hit a target. They've got to get rid of another 33,000 backlog of asylum seekers by the end of the year, and it seems a bit odd that suddenly 17,000, which is 3 times more than happened before, suddenly disappear. So there's something odd here, and I think that it bears another look at. I was astonished that the Home Office officials didn't come up with any figures. They were asked by Lee Anderson for figures that were perfectly reasonable, haven't got them. They should at least have those if they're going before a select committee.
And on Rwanda?
On Rwanda, I'm against it for practical reasons and principal reasons. I don't think that it's not very Brexity to offshore our problems to another country when we were trying to take back control.
Paul, is the Home Office run by complete dodos? Their appearance before the Select Committee yesterday made my criticisms of civil service in the past appear incredibly mild.
There does seem to be a Home Office problem running right through the story of the government and beyond. So we had a permanent secretary quitting. I think it's interesting that the focus of a lot of the bullying allegations, including ones that involve ministers who weren't in the department at all, like Michael Gove, come from the Home Office. And it does seem to be a demoralised department that plainly believes that politicians think it's not fit for purpose, in the immortal words of John Reed. However, I think you might argue that given the way government now works, the drive has to come from the top. Downing Street has to believe, if you believe immigration numbers should come down substantially, in it, and focus on it more than it's doing if you're to get the Home Office to respond. After all, I'm afraid that's part of the lesson of modern government. It's a bit like the Eye of Sauron in The Lord of the Rings. Downing Street can't do too many things at once, so it's got to be very serious about this if it really wants to do it.
So then split off immigration from the Home Office and turn it into a separate department?
That's one idea, but my point really is a simpler one, which is Rishi Sunak himself has to believe fervently, as most of his party believes, that immigration must come down. I think it is an odd fact that the last 3 leaders of the Conservative Party, including this one, were all basically immigration liberals, which is not the case for most Conservative MPs, Conservative activists, or indeed Conservative voters.
And this is part of the reason, isn't it, for all the hoo-ha about illegal migration, which is only about 5% of legal migration, that it was quite a convenient thing to target in the hope you could deal with that and nobody would notice the much bigger problem. Now they've noticed the bigger problem too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the issue there, I mean, first of all, the illegal migration is the wrong word for it. I know ministers use that word, but they are irregular migrants until those 17,000 don't turn up for their asylum interviews, then they become illegal migrants, but not until that point.
I think the law we passed earlier in this year meant that they are illegal the moment they arrive.
No, the law...
I think that's the law. You're right, the ones who appeared before that law got royal assent are asylum seekers, but that we changed it, said if you arrive through an irregular route, you're illegal the moment you arrive.
That's over the lack of documentation, isn't it? It's still illegal to arrive in this country without proper documentation.
But not via a small boat. You've got to try and come in a different route. There aren't actually, I think, any legal routes to come in as an asylum seeker at the moment. I think that's what the law change
is. Obviously, that therefore is one of the problems.
You've got to apply overseas.
There's no way of actually getting in here unless you come on a small boat.
But actually, the illegal side is small beer compared to the legal side.
Yeah, I mean, if we're dealing with that, what I'm finding peculiar about it is that everyone seems to be putting the problem in isolation. So it's become a numbers game where you're just talking about getting the figures down. Everything that people are coming up with so far to do that will have a knock-on effect. So if, for instance, you decide that care workers and nurses can't come in at a 20% wages discount, then we either don't take them or we're going to make the NHS more expensive, which means higher taxation.
Paul, I want to come back to your point on Downing Street needing to take charge, because journalists have been briefed that there was going to be the Plan B released on a number of different points, and now it's, I think, meant to be some point next week. Is this because Rishi Sunak's taking his time to make his mind up, or has it not yet got properly to Downing Street, do you think?
I don't know. I think illegal, or irregular, whatever you want to call it, is very difficult and raises some very hard choices for the government. I think, coming back to what Downing Street can and can't do, the subject of legal migration is a more suggestive one. So actually the answer to the point Nigel was raising a few moments ago was you can bring down legal immigration, but it takes time and it does cost some money. And what puzzles me is why the Prime Minister doesn't come out, make a big speech, what conventional politicians do, set out his policy in detail, and if he wants to reduce legal migration, set out a pathway to doing it, and if he doesn't, explain that he doesn't. But one way or the other, it's up to sort of politicians to take a lead and not simply be reactive and answer questions about the problem.
Well, thank you very much, my panel. Coming up, it's been a sad day as two important public servants have died, and I will be paying tribute to them both. Plus, I'll be joined by one of Britain's finest etiquette experts who will be celebrating some imperial measurements-related Brexit benefits.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GBNews, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only three people you can trust in life: your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Acquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Could you be quiet? What is this? It's my new teeth. It's your new teeth.
I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So, send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News,
the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with you three.
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays on GB News.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. We've been discussing the 17,000 migrants who have gone missing, and you have some strong views on this. And Margaret, you've sent in such a brilliant and funny response. Good evening, Jacob. What a great shame that Rishi didn't make turning on his Christmas lights one of his pledges. If he had, he would have met one of his promises. It's patently obvious he will not meet any of the others. I think that is very harsh, but it's very funny. Thank you, Margaret. It was the Yale University historian, Greg Grandin, who told Rolling Stone magazine recently, the Cubans say there is no evil that lasts 100 years, and Kissinger is making a run to prove them wrong. Well, perhaps that quote sums up the divisiveness of the now deceased US foreign policy titan, Henry Kissinger, who died last night, aged 100. Kissinger was a Jewish refugee who fled Nazi Germany to America, and it wasn't long before he became one of the most eminent names in US politics. He was pivotal in solving many crises facing the US when he became Nixon's Secretary of State in the late 1960s, with pressures increasing over the Cold War amidst the backdrop of the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, the wars in Indochina, as well as growing concerns over China's isolation during Mao's Cultural Revolution. But Kissinger divided the nation when he and Nixon resorted to a forceful bombing campaign of Cambodia as a means of strengthening the US's position against the North Vietnamese. So what to make of this Titan's legacy? Well, I'm joined now by Christian Whiten, Senior Fellow, at the Centre for National Interest and former Senior Advisor to George W. Bush. Mr. Whiten, thank you very much for joining me. And George W. Bush has given a wonderful tribute to Henry Kissinger. What is your view, and how do you think history will recognise him?
Well, I was over at the State Department during the Bush administration working on democracy projects. So even at that time, I wasn't a big fan of Henry Kissinger. Looking at him, it appeared to be someone who sought sort of coexistence peacefully with the Soviet Union, which was very different from the Reagan, Thatcher, and Bush approach of trying to end the Soviet Union. Also, he cut deals with China. He cut deals with communist Vietnam, whereas, the democracy promotion efforts that we were undertaking, look more to confrontation, to using people power to undermine regimes like that. But fast forward 20 years and looking at the position America was in when Kissinger held office and where we are today with fiscal crisis, with a series of losses, with a military that seems unable to win wars, a lot of lessons, I think, for Ukraine come from seeing Kissinger, that he was very, very good at certain things. He got us out of Vietnam, which was critically important, not just for our national power, but for our internal domestic politics. And the opening with China exposed divisions within the communist world. And later, the United States and the West was able to exploit those divisions.
But Ronald Reagan seemed to think that he was too soft on America's opponents and too keen on détente. How strong a view is that in the Republican Party, or was that very much a Reagan view not held by others?
It's certainly coming into the 1980s, after the loss in Vietnam, and that was the first war America lost, amid a military in decline, a Russia that looked like the Soviet Union, that looked like it was ascendant, to get Western Europe also facing the same economic troubles that the United States did. It sort of made sense, I think, politically to say, well, we've been too weak about that. Today, the Republican Party, I think, is in a very different place than it was at that time, or it was even 10 or 15 years ago. If you look at support for Ukraine and for sending more money to Ukraine specifically has eroded quickly. And the idea of taking on more foreign obligations, of paying for more foreign governments, looking at having stayed too long in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's not leading to isolationism, but I think there's a lot more reticence, certainly among Republicans like Donald Trump and the majority of the right in the U.S.
And Henry Kissinger's advice was sought by Democrat as well as Republican presidents, that I think other than Joe Biden, every president since Nixon had seen him and consulted him. This is an extraordinary status to have held, isn't it?
It is. And actually, he was Nelson Rockefeller's advisor. Rockefeller was technically a Republican, but a very liberal Republican. It was somewhat shocking that Richard Nixon, who had originally made his name as a member of the House of Representatives, as a communist hunter, and then as a very hawkish vice president to Dwight D. Eisenhower, went through this evolution and actually brought Kissinger onto his campaign and into his White House.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. It's much appreciated. And with me now is my panel, editor of Conservative Fame, Paul Goodman, and GB News' senior political commentator, Nigel Nelson. Paul, realpolitik, is it morally justifiable?
The question about Kissinger and realpolitik really takes you back to the Cold War and the circumstances that not everyone will remember now. But for those of us living in Europe, you'd America here, and the Soviet Union, Ronald Reagan's evil empire here. So always, with foreign policy and defence and security, there's a sort of trade-off between what you would ideally like to do and the terrible choices you face in the real world, then in El Salvador or Afghanistan, and with the possibility, it always seemed then, of the Soviet tanks rolling into Western Europe, because after all, they're in Germany. So realpolitik, which Kissinger's associated with, I think in the real world, there's no alternative in policy in the national interest but to have a big element of it.
And Nigel, that's where you get into the moral dilemma of, well, he's our dictator rather than their dictator, and therefore we will support him. And so you back Pinochet and you help overthrow the previous regime because you're always supporting your side, because that is what you need to project strength against a dangerous enemy. Is that justifiable in your view?
Well, I mean, that's what took the shine off his legacy, really, that when it was revealed what he got up to in South America with the CIA, I think that we all began to look again at him. I mean, he was one of my when I was young, he was one of my heroes. I thought that the détente with Soviet Union, détente with China, all made the world a bit of a safer place. So I think that the realpolitik that Paul's talking about there, I can understand, for instance, the bombing of Cambodia. He admits himself he made a mistake over Vietnamization by trying to replace replace American troops with South Vietnamese troops, lengthen the war. But he accepts that was a mistake. You can't get everything right. The fact that you kill people in the process, I think that was sort of the position he was put in, and it's the old thing about, do you do something like that for a greater good?
And that he did manage to achieve quite a lot of successes in terms of peace, that détente, but also, crucially, peace between Egypt and Israel. His relationship with President Sadat was very important.
He did. He went very much out of fashion, because in the balance between the realist view on the one side, of which Kissinger is a kind of icon, and the idealist view on the other side, he went out of fashion. Jimmy Carter came in, who was more of an idealist, as in his way was Ronald Reagan. I mean, as Nigel said a few moments ago, there was a point where Reagan thought he might get Kissinger back with Gerald Ford as his vice presidential candidate. Reagan didn't want that. He didn't want Kissinger. He didn't want the Nixon legacy. He didn't want realpolitik at that stage. He wanted to confront the Soviets. And it's only later, You get détente and Gorbachev and glasnost and the full Reagan legacy we remember.
Yes. Well, Henry Kissinger is not the only political giant worthy of tribute today. This afternoon it was announced that the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Alistair Darling, died at the age of 70, reaching the milestone birthday just 2 days ago. Lord Darling served loyally and diligently in the governments of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, particularly successfully as Chancellor when he managed to deal with the global financial crisis. Lord Darling was a formidable and respected figure across the political spectrum, and after leaving government threw himself into worthy and admirable causes, most notably lending his support to the campaign for his homeland of Scotland to remain part of the United Kingdom in the 2014 independence referendum. It's time to consider his legacy. I mean, when somebody dies and dies relatively young, even their political opponents inevitably say nice things about them. But, Paul, I think both you and I genuinely thought highly of Alistair Darling. I particularly thought, as Chancellor, he handled the financial crisis as well as anybody could have done.
He was the first really senior Labour figure I had anything to do with when I came into the Commons as a young Conservative backbencher in 2001. He was the Work and Pensions Secretary and seen very much as Gordon Brown's ally. And I found he was tough, he was decent, he was straightforward. We knew that the Blairites felt they could talk to him. And he was very funny in his dry way. I remember he had the committee in and he said, pension reform, yes, he said, it's not exactly a conversation. And he said this in a much drier and funnier way than I'm saying it. It is not a conversation you have every night at the Dog and Duck. And he had a way of, in his understated, dry way, of dealing with a subject very nicely and straightforwardly.
And Nigel, you must have known him quite well.
I did, yeah.
And his influence in the Scottish referendum, the independence referendum, was very important because he bound Labour into that and protecting the Union.
Yes, it was something he really believed in, that keeping the Union together was something terribly important. I mean, what always impressed me about him was just how calm he was. I mean, you both said no one had a harsh word to say about him, but he was incredibly calm. And I always found him incredibly kind. He was patient with economic sickos like me, would spend time actually explaining something. I remember that when he cut VAT by 2.5% during the financial crisis, I was a bit sceptical about the £12 billion cost and approached him about it. He patiently explained why he had done it. He had no need to. And it turned out he was right. 3 months later, growth in retail sales doubled. So it worked.
And he was very early to realise that the financial crisis was coming, which is a hard wisdom to have because politicians very often believe their own propaganda, that they've sorted out the economy. And he realised that these huge forces coming in from the United States and in our own banking system were a reality, and therefore he started to prepare for them early.
Yes, which obviously meant that when it did finally arrive, I mean, if we go back to that, it arrived overnight, basically. I mean, it's for history to judge whether or not what he did was inspirational on the day or whether there was no choice. So bailing out the banks, that we were looking at a situation where we were about to have no money in a few hours' time if he hadn't done what he did. And no money would mean our credit cards would stop working. We couldn't get cash out of banks, which would have closed their doors. By the end of the week, we'd have civil unrest. So it was the tightrope he was walking at the time was a really tricky one.
And this saved the country from, as I was saying, potentially disorder if they hadn't got those decisions right.
Historians will argue about to what degree Gordon Brown, who's a very interventionist Prime Minister, and to what degree Alistair Darling were responsible for trying to sort it out. I mean, what struck me in the months leading up to the 2010 election was Brown and Darling were going different ways, because Brown's textbook for fighting an election always was Labour spending against Tory cuts. I've won elections like that, he used to say. And Alistair Darling, being a sort of honest bloke, gave this interview that some of us remember when he was on holiday in Scotland, I think in the summer of 2009, I think, where he said, the crisis is going to be really bad.
Yeah.
And Gordon Brown and Doug were furious because he let the cat out of the bag and had ruined the Labour story of Labour investment versus Tory cuts.
Well, I think we've just been talking about two very decent public servants who actually give politicians a good name and remind us that some good people do go into politics to try and serve their country, one from the right and one from the left. May their souls and the souls of all the faithful departed by the mercy of God rest in peace. Thank you to my panel. Coming up, the moment you've all been waiting for, we'll be answering the vital question: is it time for pints of wine and champagne? Is Champagne Charlie secretly my name?
You know, I've been a pop star, I've been a TV presenter, I've danced on Strictly, I've faced some of my biggest fears on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, and now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to face my biggest challenge of all by joining GB News with Ellie Costello and Peter Andre.
For the brightest start to your weekend with all the news, the biggest stories, plus some special guests.
Join me, Peter Andre.
And me, Ellie Costello, for Saturday Morning Live from 10.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show.
Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else.
We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride.
Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse.
It's news, but it's this close to entertainment.
Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I continue to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this continues to identify State of the Nation. And we've been discussing the deaths of Alistair Darling and Henry Kissinger. And here are your thoughts. Sue says, I think Sue's got this absolutely right. Alistair Darling was one of Labour's last great people. If he was still there, I might have voted for them. And Brett says, everyone in the UK knows Henry Kissinger. Says a lot about the impact he had on the world. And I've been trying to think, how many other former US Secretaries of State can one name just off the top of one's head? I came up with Condoleezza Rice immediately, but other than that, I'm a bit stretched. Anyway, Madeleine Albright too. It's been 52 years since the lachrymose day when 240 pennies to the pound became simply 100 new pence, and subsequently restrictive EU laws meant Britain moved to the deplorable metric system. But rejoice, because it's been announced that a change in drinking laws is imminent, and within months Britain can return to the impeccable imperial measurement that was favoured by our wartime hero Winston Churchill. In layman's terms, now that we've left the EU and its prohibiting laws, we could soon be able to go to our local shops and purchase pints of wine and champagne, a change that will be welcomed by many, I suspect. Another win for Brexiteers, and surely Remainers can get behind this change as well. Well, Vox Populi, Vox Day, we ask the great British people if it's time for pints of champagne, and the people have spoken.
I think they should, definitely. Obviously, having the biggest amount, it would be more beneficial.
Yeah, I think so. It will be more convenient if I get a pint, you know?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea, but with champagne, probably not best because it's so expensive.
I totally disagree with that, because when I was 18, I used to drink, and I actually ended up with an addiction of drinking. Selling drinks by higher quantities is just a recipe for disaster.
I mean, if it's a shoe shop, you wouldn't sell champagne or wine. Should an alcohol shop sell champagne or wine? Only in bottles. Litres of champagne will be okay.
Well, if you can get a big enough glass.
Well, perhaps we should have pints of champagne and yards of ale, but I'm joined now by the etiquette expert Laura Windsor, who, like me, is anti rather than pro-Prosecco, but very much pro-champagne.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's a good idea, isn't it, that we should be able to have pints of champagne? It's a proper size for a drink.
Yes. I mean, Winston Churchill liked it, so why not?
Why not? And a pint of wine, however, might be a little bit large.
A pint of wine?
A pint of wine is going to be possible, but I can see that if you have a pint of wine, that's quite a good measure to share rather than drink by yourself. It's that little bit bigger than a half bottle.
Yes.
And a half bottle isn't quite enough. And a pint, very nicely, for two people, I would have thought just that little bit less than a full regular-sized bottle.
Yes, I'm sure we'll be very grateful for it.
And what is the etiquette of drinking champagne? You see, I happen to think, and Camilla Tominey was pointing this earlier, you should drink champagne in a silver tankard. I think that's the proper way to drink it, and it brings the flavour out better.
In a
silver tankard. Does this meet with your etiquette approval?
Oh, no.
Oh, no?
No, I like them in the coupe.
Ah, yes, they're very elegant. They're Marie Antoinette.
That's correct.
Yes.
But unfortunately, all the fizz goes out really quickly, so the flute would be the better option.
But do you like lots of fizz in your champagne? I quite like them.
Yes. Oh, yes, if it's not fizzy...
It needs to be fizzy to start with, but it's quite nice when it goes out in the coupes, don't you think? A little...
Well, they're so small that who wants to leave any
so you want a pint-sized coupe? That would be quite something.
No, I think... I get tipsy very quickly, so I don't think that would be...
So it's lucky
favourable.
we were going to do a tasting to see if you and I could tell the difference between champagne and Prosecco, but Addison Lee, who pretended to offer a taxi service, failed to send one for me, so I had to drive, and therefore I can't have a drink whilst I'm driving off home.
I'm sorry to hear that.
But do you think you'd
there's
spot
a big
Prosecco...
difference. Oh, yes.
All the same, aren't we just being snooty?
No. The qualities are so different. But to make Prosecco, it's very quick. It takes around 30 days, actually, to make a Prosecco in large quantities. The second fermentation is put into these big tanks, and you can make so much of it, and that's why it's much cheaper. It's not done the champenoise method.
Which takes quite a long time.
It does, indeed, and a lot of work as well. So, no, you can definitely tell the difference between champagne and Prosecco.
But English champagne is really now very good, isn't it?
It is.
I'm afraid...
I'm surprised. Sorry,
yes,
I shouldn't say that.
I used to be very sniffy about it until a friend of mine brought me some, and I thought, absolutely delicious, really. This was Night Timber. I thought it was so good.
It can be.
And was very, very, very impressed.
Well, a little birdie just recently told me that it's because our weather is so similar to where it's the Champagne region is, and our soil is also quite chalky like that of the Champagne region, and therefore we are capable of making some really good champagne.
So it's one of the benefits of global warming. But we've got a reminder of why everyone should enjoy drinking champagne. I think it's from Tommy Trinder. Are we ready to go with Tommy Trinder?
Champagne Charlie is my name. Champagne drinking is my game. There's no drink as good as fizz, fizz, fizz. I'll drink every drop there is.
Don't you think that's perfect? It's full of fizz, 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 and I'll drink every drop that there is. Or ought we to be warning people on sensible drinking? What's the etiquette? I imagine you tell people they shouldn't get drunk.
Well, getting drunk means loss of control, self-control, which isn't...
Which never meets etiquette requirements, does it?
Not really. People will remember, and they may not invite you to the next party.
And at the heart of all etiquette is self-control.
That's correct. And respect for other people. You don't want to be blubbering out to grandma something and she can't understand you and you're falling all over the place. So it's not a great look. So
we should enjoy our pints of champagne. We should certainly enjoy Champagne Charlie, which is such a good tune.
Yes.
We should avoid the Prosecco, though some people quite like it as a mixer. You can put it in with other things, can't you?
Prosecco?
Yes.
Yes, you can, but it still isn't as great as having a champagne cocktail, mixing it.
No, champagne cocktails are very nice.
They are,
yes,
indeed.
no, much to be recommended, though, again, one shouldn't have too many of them. What's your favourite champagne?
Ruinart.
And from a coupe, but drunk quickly so that it doesn't go flat.
No. Well, yes, in a coupe,
OK,
yes.
well, I'm going to stick to my silver tankard, though I'm now put to shame by an etiquette expert.
Yes, I'd love to see you do that, actually.
Well, the next time you come on, I'll make sure that I have a proper taxi, and then I'll be able to have a drink. Anyway, thank you very much, Laura. Finally, some more good news, though perhaps not as good news as pints of champagne. Rumour has it that as many as 40% of the civil service is considering quitting their jobs. And you might ask what ghastly conditions they're being forced into to prompt such a potential mass exodus. Well, the outrage, the shock, it's a requirement that they actually show up to the office all of 3 days a week. But this is fantastic news because it will help us on our way to reducing the civil service by 90,000 to the pre-Brexit level and the plan we had worked on under Boris Johnson's premiership, and it'll save us on the redundancy payments. So we can have a pint of champagne when we get home, safely, to celebrate. Well, that's all from me. I think we've now got Mr. Christie's to talk to us. Patrick.
Yes, good evening, Jacob. Cracking show. I've got a lot on tonight. I'm asking whether or not Rishi Sunak should sack those civil servants who turned up woefully unprepared yesterday on immigration. The king of the travellers, Paddy Doherty, joins me to discuss councils getting tough on travellers' sites. Is that OK? Is it, as some people say, the only quote-unquote acceptable form of racism against travellers? That's a view that Paddy thinks anyway. A BBC star claims that an all-white, or mostly white office anyway, is affecting his mental health. And I have a world exclusive for you tomorrow, and I'll reveal who it's with later on this show. It's a good one.
A world exclusive, but you won't tell us now. Will you tell me as I sneak out of the studio and promise I don't tweet it on my way home?
Maybe if you give me a pint of champagne.
Oh, definitely. That seems to me to be a very good deal. Well, look, that's all from me for this week. I'll be back on Monday at 8 o'clock. Somerset is going to be having glorious weather. Even when it snows in Somerset, it's an exquisite form of snow with those perfect snow crystals that make you think that it's the finest snow anywhere in the world. In Somerset.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good evening, welcome to your latest GB News weather update from the Met Office. Friday is going to be another dry day for many of us, but it will be feeling very cold once again, with potentially some freezing fog to start and some snow showers. We've seen snow as a result of this frontal system bumping into the cold air across parts of the southwest. That will clear away throughout the course of the night, but it will leave with it a risk of ice on the roads across parts of Devon and Cornwall. There's also a risk of some ice across the northeast of England, as well as many eastern areas of Scotland as a result of the snow showers. You could also see some icy stretches across parts of Northern Ireland. So there'll be another very cold start tomorrow morning. It could be as low as -7, -8 once again. There'll also be some freezing fog patches across many central and eastern areas. These could be quite slow to clear. There'll also be some showers starting to come in across parts of Suffolk. We could see some sleetiness within this as well. But for many of us, it will be a dry day with some winter sunshine, but temperatures still really struggling, 2 or 3 degrees at best in many places. And then Saturday is going to start on a very cold note. We could be down as low as minus double digits. Some crisp sunshine to be had, mostly across northeastern areas this time, with showers moving in from the west. These showers could fall as snow over the high ground of Wales and potentially across central areas as well. But things turn somewhat less cold early next week.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays on GB News.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've